So Marlborough is situated at the very northern end of the South Island of New Zealand. We have a very maritime climate. The temperature rarely exceeds 30 degrees centigrade, even in the middle of summer, but we get very high sunshine hours and very intense sunlight. The concept of terroir involves this combination of the soil and climate of a wine region. More recently, it's been suggested that the human influence is also very much part of the terroir of a wine district. At Greywacke, we like to take that one step further and suggest that microflora is in fact also part of the terroir. The yeast, the bacteria, are indeed part of the terroir of Marlborough. So I first started making wine in New Zealand in 1983, and I first moved to Marlborough in 1985. So I've been making wine in Marlborough for a long time. But after 25 years in my previous role, I decided it was time. I turned 50 and I realised it was now or never. So in 2009, Kimberly and I established Greywacke.
Greywacke was established in 2009. The reason we called the vineyard Greywacke was it was full of these Greywacke stones. Our vineyard back in '89 that we had was very, very stony, and so we found the name Greywacke actually in the dictionary and decided to call the vineyard Greywacke, and that's where we've come from.
And Richard Ellis joined us, about 2 years ago?
Greywacke is a really young company, but I think we've come a long way in a short space of time. We're certainly not complacent, and one thing that we do in the winery a lot of is experimenting. And in fact, one of the first things Kevin said to me when I started was, look, if you want to experiment with any of the wines, by all means let me know. And we've taken that philosophy, and every year we're trying to be a little bit different. We're trying to take the things that we really liked from the previous vintage and do a bit more of that the following. So we're certainly not resting on our laurels. It's about constantly innovating and trying to push the boundary. Our winemaking style at Greywacke is quite minimal intervention, quite hands-off. I think one thing that we've learned over the years is what not to worry about as opposed to what to worry about.
With all the wines we make at Greywacke, we're trying to make a style of wine that is very specific to the variety.
The style of Sauvignon Blanc that we're looking to make here at Greywacke is a lot riper than has traditionally come out of the Marlborough region.
So we're working with beautiful mature vineyards. We're growing the fruit in nice open canopies, a little bit of dappled light onto the fruit.
Stylistically, we're very much moving away from the green, grassy, herbaceous styles of Sauvignon Blanc, and it's not to say that they're not good, it's just not the style that we're looking to make.
So it's harvested in April one year, and it's released in the October of that same year. Whereas the Wild is very different, and giving it the name Wild, we were hoping that people would realise that just looking at the label, there's something a little bit different about this wine.
With the Wild Sauvignon, we literally put the juice into old barrels and go and do something else. We leave it to its own devices. So this is very hands-off winemaking. This is
cross our fingers and walk away for a year and just hope that the wild yeast that happen to be living on the grapes and that have been transferred into the juice as we've pressed them will kick into gear and do their thing.
Which is not something they taught me to do at Roseworthy College, I can assure you.
What we love with the use of wild fermentation and old oak barrels is that it gives us a far more floral, nutty, savoury style of Sauvignon Blanc.
So Greywacke Pinot Noir is a very aromatic, spicy style of Pinot. We source our fruit entirely from the southern valleys.
Pinot for me is the variety I'm the most excited about for Marlborough. For a long time as a region we've been growing Pinot vines in the wrong locations, we've had the wrong clones, and for good reason. A lot of the world have disregarded us as a Pinot producing region. About 20 years ago we imported better clones from Burgundy. We started growing up onto the hillside vineyards in the southern valleys, and that's where all of the fruit for our Pinot Noir comes from.
We do produce other wines. We produce Chardonnay, Pinot Gris and Riesling.
Across the board, what we're looking to achieve with all of our wines here at Greywacke is a really ripe, layered style of wine. We're trying to showcase the best that Marlborough can do.
So the images on the labels are all images from my first book, which was called The Colour of Wine, which we published in 1999. In my final 5 years in my last role, I was 2/3 winemaker, 1/3 photographer. My wine photography hero was a guy called Mick Rock in London. And one day he came to visit me to take photographs. I relished the opportunity to meet him, and I showed him some of my pictures, and he invited me to contribute to his library, and that was that was a turning point, really. That's when it went from being just a hobby to being more or semi-commercial sort of thing. Wine is a very subjective thing, like anything, and that's where I think it sort of is wine an art or a science? It's both, really. I mean, you have to have an understanding of science to make wine, but at the end of the day, you're creating something that is being judged by someone's senses. There's an art in that.
Okay, so nice video there. Wine is very subjective, very much of an art and science. That's what Kevin said, the owner of Greywacke. Hello everyone, I'm Amy, the brand ambassador of Crystal Wines. Thank you for being punctual and for attending yet another virtual tasting masterclass of ours. This round, very interesting winery, of course, is Greywacke. A little bit of notes before I pass on to Greywacke's winemaker Richard Ellis to take on the show. For quality assurance purposes, we would unfortunately have to mute most of us, just in case your dog is barking and all. But along the way, at any time throughout the presentation, if you do have any questions, please type it in the group chat, and we'll have them answered for you at the end of the session, or if I find that the question is very valid for that particular point of time, I will raise it up to Richard to answer it. If it's a very long question and you're very lazy to type, PM us or PM Crystal Wines. We will then unmute you, and then you are allowed to ask your questions verbally. So, I have this friend, just a little bit about tasting today. I know you have all your 5 tasting wines in front of you, and it's really tempting and you cannot wait to taste them. I have a friend who religiously attends our Crystal Wines virtual tasting. I think she's in here today, and each time she always tells me, Amy, I can't resist, I'm going to taste the wines now. So don't be like her. She's very naughty. Don't be like her, because today's tasting session, if it's hosted by Richard, I'm sure it's going to be so enlightening, and he's going to point out some really interesting flavor characteristics that you will want to see for yourself if you're able to smell it, or if you agree with us on the tasting notes and all. So be patient. We'll go through the presentation slides, and very shortly we can do the tasting together. Okay. So without further ado, I will pass on to Richard Ellis, the winemaker of Greywacke, to present, to facilitate the rest of the session. A little bit about Richard Ellis. He is winemaker of Greywacke since 2013, so he's been with Greywacke for a long time already today. He has degree in viticulture at the very illustrious Lincoln University, but don't be mistaken that he was just a winemaker. He was also very much into marketing and sales in his entire career. So he's, you can say that he has the heart of the wine and also the mind of the wine. He knows exactly what the consumer likes to drink, and therefore today we have the honor to try Greywacke wines. So over to you, Richard. Take on the presentation.
Great. Thanks very much, Amy, and obviously to the team at Crystal Wines for inviting me along to host this session this afternoon, and of course to all of you who have joined us for this Greywacke tasting. It's a real privilege, and it seems to be a common thing in these days of COVID-19 to be doing Zoom tastings around the world. So nice to be working with Singapore this afternoon. So as Amy said, I've been with Greywacke for the last 6.5 years, primarily as winemaker, but I do, and given that Greywacke is a very small team, put on a sales and marketing hat, and so I do try to get to Singapore every few years, and I was last up there about a year or so ago. To be honest, at the moment in New Zealand, at least in Marlborough, a few days ago, it was about -3 or -4 in the morning. So, you know, you go to jump in the car in the morning and the doors are frozen shut. I think, to be honest, being in Singapore, it's a little bit warmer, would be quite nice, a quite nice place to be based at the moment. But look, what I thought I'd do is we've just got a relatively brief PowerPoint presentation, and I know a lot of what I could talk about in this presentation has been covered lightly or briefly in the video that you've just watched. But hopefully, if there's any points that you missed, I'll be able to cover those. So I thought what I'd do is talk a little bit sorry, I'll start that again. We'll talk a little bit about who Greywacke is, or who's behind it, where we've come from, and where we're located, and also a bit more in depth about the wines that we make. And then we'll go into a tasting, and we'll taste through each of the wines that we're going to taste this evening. We're going to taste 5 of the 7 wines that we make at Greywacke, so a really good snapshot of the range. And then, as Diana and Amy and the Crystal Wines team have told me, we're going to have, and explained, we're going to have a question and answer session. And I really do hope that if you either don't understand my funny New Zealand accent, or if there are questions that you really are keen to know about, that you put them forward. I'm really happy to answer any questions that you have. So if we jump through to the next slide. Thanks, Cheryl. So as I said, who or what is Greywacke? So if we jump forward, I don't have control of the PowerPoint presentation. Just to explain, if you're wondering why I keep instructing Cheryl, who's kindly working at Crystal Wines, to move the slides, it's because she has the power. I'm sitting here in New Zealand, where I can direct the proceedings remotely. But look, as you've seen on the video, so Greywacke is a relatively young company. We were started back in 2009 by Kevin Judd, who, as you can see, likes to spend a lot of his time, if not behind a camera, then relaxing on the barrels, while the rest of us, including his wife Kimberly on the right, are busy in the winery doing the hands-on hard work. And as I think Kevin mentioned in that video, prior to setting up Greywacke, Kevin was actually the founding winemaker and chief winemaker at Cloudy Bay. Some of you, I'm sure, are familiar with that particular winery from Marlborough. If you had the chance to meet Kevin, and if you didn't pick up from that video, he's a fairly quiet kind of guy. He's not an extrovert. I was explaining to the Crystal Wines team this afternoon, if you meet him online on a computer, he seems very extroverted, but in fact, in person, he's a very quiet, humble sort of character. But he and Kimberly moved across to New Zealand in the early 1980s from Australia, where they'd both grown up. And they came across to New Zealand at that stage in 1983 because Kevin had only recently graduated from winemaking college in South Australia. He'd had a couple of years winemaking experience under his belt. And he thought, well, New Zealand at that point in time, you know, going on close to 40 years ago, was really the Wild West of New World winemaking. It really didn't have a great history in terms of modern winemaking. And he thought it would be a really cool experience to come across and see what was going on. So he promised Kimberly that they would just be there for 3 years. And as I say, nearly 40 years later, In fact, Kevin and Kimberly have just been made New Zealand citizens, so they're here for the long haul, which we're really grateful for. In the later stage of 1984, Kevin met another Australian winemaker, a gentleman by the name of David Honan. And David Honan was the owner of I've just had a mind blank, sorry, of Cape Mentel, actually. I haven't talked about that winery for a while, but he was the owner of Cape Mentel Winery in Margaret River, which is in the western part of Australia. And David had been left an early example of Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc, and he thought, wow, you'd never tasted a wine like this. So in 1984, came across to New Zealand, got introduced to Kevin, and they got on pretty well from an early stage. And so he invited Kevin to come and join him and found, or at least be the founding winemaker of what became Clardy Bay. So that was 1985, first vintage. Kevin steered the ship as chief winemaker and did that for 25 years. And although if you spoke to him, and as I've asked him personally, you know, how did this feel? And he would just explain to you that this was, you know, he was in the right time at the right place. But really, if you speak to anyone in New Zealand about Kevin Judd, he is considered a pioneer of the New Zealand wine industry. He really did help to put New Zealand on the map. I think it was the 1986 vintage of Clardy Bay that really took at least the London wine scene by storm and really set the scene for modern New Zealand wines at that period of time. So thanks to Kevin and a small handful of other Marlborough wineries at the time, New Zealand Sauvignon Blanc, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc was launched, and that really catapulted us to where we're at today. I should point out in terms of the world wine production too, so in 1985 there was 5 wineries in Marlborough. Today there's around 120. We produce, and we've only just tipped over 1% of the world's wine production. So New Zealand is a tiny country. We've probably made a reasonably big splash, particularly with Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. Hopefully, as we go through the wines today, we'll certainly show you that we can indeed make some pretty compelling Sauvignon Blanc, but also a handful of other wines and varieties. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So Kevin and Kimberly, during their time at Clardy Bay, they developed a vineyard. It was just behind the Clardy Bay Winery. If you've ever spent time in Marlborough, they developed this vineyard planted on an old riverbed full of these gravelly Greywacke stones. And they discovered, as Kimberly explained in the video, what the name of these rocks were. They were probably, to be honest, cursing these stones because they were trying to drive vineyard posts into the ground on this old riverbed. It would have been incredibly hard work. And they discovered what these rocks were called, named their vineyard Greywacke Vineyards. And in fact, at Clardy Bay in the early days, Kevin was convinced to volunteer some fruit for an experiment, and he volunteered some Sauvignon Blanc in the 1992 vintage for this barrel-fermented wild yeast Sauvignon Blanc, which they only sold through the cellar door the following year. And when he saw the label at the time, I think it said Clardy Bay 1992 Reserve Sauvignon Blanc Greywacke Vineyards. When he saw that name on a label, the light bulb turned on, and he thought that looks really cool. And so that year, he and Kimberly, in fact, registered the name Greywacke, and they thought, if we ever start our own winery, we're going to call it Greywacke. So, you know, fast forward 16 years in time for the 2009 harvest, they realized that dream, and that's where Greywacke came from. So if we just jump forward a slide there, Cheryl, as Kevin alluded to, he's not only a really talented winemaker, he's also a really passionate and quite talented photographer. In fact, he's produced a number of books, and as he mentioned, his first book, which he called The Colour of Wine, formed the basis for the labels of our wine. So you've all got those and the sample bottles today. I see the Crystal Wines team have done a great job of replicating our labels, and all of those labels are photographs from that first book. So a really, I guess, unenviable position, I think, to have to design a wine label that stands out and is unique and distinctive. But at least for Greywacke, we can take advantage of Kevin's artistic talents and use his photographs as a key part of our identity. So that's a little bit about who's behind Greywacke. And I thought what would be really good is just to, particularly for those of you that haven't visited New Zealand, is talk a bit about where we're from. And for those of you that do know New Zealand or have visited and are familiar with the region, I thought we could dive very quickly into some of the sub-regions in Marlborough, just to give a slightly more in-depth explanation as to why the wines taste the way they do and why we grow the vines in the particular locations that we do for Greywacke. So if we jump ahead, so, if we go back a slide, this is just to reiterate the name Greywacke. If you didn't pick this up on the video, it is the name of this particular rock that is found extensively throughout Marlborough, and in fact, right throughout New Zealand. If, as it says, we were to have a national rock in New Zealand, we would have to call it Greywacke. It's this really highly compressed sedimentary stone. You know, in New Zealand we have lots of earthquakes, and in Marlborough it means that the rivers have changed course, and these grey river stones form the basis of a lot of the Sauvignon Blanc plantings in Marlborough. So where are we from? Well, I think hopefully most of you know where New Zealand is. At times like this, with lots of COVID going on, if you just go back again, sorry, Cheryl, you know, most of the year in normal times we would say, look, we're so far away, it would be so much nicer to be somewhere like Singapore, which has got lots of neighbours around and make us a lot closer to the rest of the world. But at this point in time, obviously having a huge sea border, that's a really positive thing in terms of protecting our borders. But we are two very small islands in the middle of the South Pacific Ocean, a long way away from the rest of the world. So if you jump ahead there again, I thought what I'd do is just quickly to provide some context as to the size of New Zealand. So that's overlaid Japan, and I was looking at some figures compared to Singapore yesterday, and I think we are somewhere around 370 to 400 times larger than Singapore. And I saw a figure just out of interest, and you might find this not so interesting, but fascinating. So in Singapore, I see you've got about 7,600 people per square kilometre. In New Zealand, we have 18. So we have a population of 5 million in a space that is significantly larger. Obviously, we're nowhere near the equator, and so we're a much cooler, more temperate part of the world. And when we jump through to the next slide, we'll be able to talk about why, and ahead again, Cheryl, where Marlborough is located and why it is such a good place to grow not only Sauvignon Blanc, but varieties like Chardonnay and Pinot Gris and Pinot Noir. So hopefully you can see the top of the South Island there. So when New Zealand was being named, the English settlers were very creative. They put a lot of thought into what they would call our two islands, and we've got the North Island, and you guessed it, we've also got the South Island. So Marlborough is located in the top northeastern corner of that South Island. It is the sunniest part of New Zealand. We get about 2,500 hours of sunshine per year, and it's relatively dry. We don't get a lot of rainfall. About 700 millimeters of rain per year. In terms of our climate, we're quite maritime influenced. You know, you can see clearly that the ocean surrounds us, you know, and from our main Pinot Noir vineyard, which incidentally, the photograph in my background is a photograph from our Pinot Noir vineyard, a hillside vineyard on a clear day, I can actually look across from our Pinot vineyard and see Wellington in the North Island, which is the capital of New Zealand. So that distance isn't that large, not as far as the crow flies. It is either a 20-minute plane ride or a 3.5-hour ferry ride between the North and South Island. So the marine environment has a big influence on our climate. It stops Marlborough getting too hot during summertime, and in summer, a really hot day for Marlborough would be around 30, in an extreme season. And I saw this, in 2019, I saw 1 or 2 days where we got to 37 degrees, but that was really unusual. Normally 30 degrees Celsius is a hot day. And probably one of the most important climatic characteristics that helps us develop these intensely fruity, crisp, characteristic wines that you can't get in other parts of the world is that to where Marlborough is, obviously. So you can see in the, as we talked about a little bit earlier, the fact that we're at the northeastern corner of the South Island. And as I say, one little story I should tell you. So I mentioned that on a clear day, we can look across and see Wellington from our Pinot Noir vineyard. So if I was standing on the vineyard, and in fact, I'm not in the vineyard, just in case you're wondering. If I was standing on the particular vineyard in the photo behind me, and I looked across on a clear day, I would see the wind turbines on the hills of Wellington. Well, that stretch of water that divides the North Island and South Island can be really treacherous. And in fact, just to show you how different the climate is between Marlborough, as I said, the really sheltered baseball glove-like geography and climate that we have, versus somewhere like Wellington, which is also like a baseball glove, but in fact it tends to catch all of the wind. So about 3 or 4 years ago, I was working in the winery outside on this winter day, so sort of July or so, June, July in Marlborough, and it was blue skies, sunny, not a breath of wind. Well, that evening I got home, turned on the news, and the car ferry that travels between the North Island and South Island had experienced such rough conditions. There was a 5 to 7 metre swell in that stretch of water, the Cook Strait. It had been so rough that a truck and trailer unit had its trailer unit tip over the side of the ferry and into the ocean. So while we can have this incredibly clear, calm conditions, in such a close proximity to Wellington, their conditions can be totally different. As I say, being surrounded on 3 sides by mountains, it means that the prevailing weather just passes beyond us and it just funnels directly into Wellington. So it really is a pretty unique part of the country to be growing grapes. If we just jump forward again to the next slide.
So I would assume no vineyards in Wellington. No. The climate is totally different. They would probably get half the sunshine and probably twice as much rain as we get. So it's really not a great place for growing grapes. Just outside of Wellington, an hour drive over the hills, you can grow grapes really well. In Martinborough, but in Wellington City and the region, it's not so good. Okay.
So, have we got control of the PowerPoint now? If we jump ahead one slide.
Yeah.
Just got that. I'm just waiting for retail to kick
Next slide.
Pause. Yeah, great. So look, the 3 sub-regions I talked about, just quickly, the Wairau Valley is the orange sub-region. As I say, that's the most common, it's the largest of the 3 sub-regions. I mentioned that if you grow Sauvignon Blanc closer to the coast, where you can see it talks about Cloudy Bay and the Wairau River, you get more of those sweety passion fruit, tropical fruit flavors. You can see in the middle there, you can see a blue dot in the word Simmerlands, and also to the south of there, Clouston. They're 2 of our Sauvignon Blanc vineyards. They're a lot more of that stone fruit and citrus. And if you were to go 65 kilometres west up the Wairau River, it's climbing in altitude and it's getting cooler, and you get more of those herbal, grassy styles of Sauvignon Blanc emerging. The yellow region, the southern valleys, this is what I was talking about with reference to Pinot Noir. The hillside vineyards, which is mostly what's been planted there, with these loose clay soils, really, really important locations for growing really good quality Pinot Noir. You know, if you grow on the valley floor on those near the Simmerlands vineyard, you tend to get this really raspberry, strawberry kind of style of Pinot, pretty light bodied. If you grow up on the hillsides on these clay soils, they're typically darker and richer and a lot spicier. And then finally, where it says Seddon, the purple subregion, that's the Awatere Valley. It's the coldest, windiest part of Marlborough. It's a pretty large region in its own right. It accounts for about 30% of Marlborough's fruit. And that's where you get more of that tomato stalk characteristic in your Sauvignon Blanc. So jumping forward, I think everyone's probably getting pretty thirsty. That's a really good example there of the Wairau Valley. So, you know, that's an extremely stony vineyard. Not all of the vineyards are quite as stony as that. It's a pretty flat subregion. As I say, it's an old floodplain where the river's wound its way down this particular valley over you know, the last 10,000 years or so. It's really fantastic part of Marlborough for growing Sauvignon Blanc and other white varieties. As I say, Pinot Noir needs a little bit more clay in the soils, and as you can see there, that's largely alluvial, stony, free-draining soils. That's full of Greywacke rock in that particular photograph. The next subregion, if you jump forward, is just showing you the southern valleys.
Next slide.
Which hopefully so again, this is another photo of the vineyard that I've got behind me. This is our Yarram vineyard. As I say, it's in the southern part of the Wairau Valley, 4 valleys. It's mostly that windblown clay soil, and it's really the home of the modern style of Pinot Noir from Marlborough, and I would say the future of Pinot Noir from Marlborough. And if you go to the next slide, it just shows you a couple of shots, or it shows you a shot there from the Awatere Valley. So a big river valley, lots of terraces, very stony soils, similar in some respects to what you see in the Wairau Valley, but just colder and windier. A really interesting sub-region, but not one that we take fruit from for Greywacke. So jumping ahead. So what do we do? Well, hopefully by now you've realized that we make wine. And so you might even be able to play this video. I'm not sure if you can click the bottom left there, but we don't typically foot stomp our fruit, but in some years, if we're making a sweet dessert style wine, we'll actually foot stomp our Pinot Gris grapes. And this was taken from 2018, where we picked a little bit of Botrytis Pinot Gris grapes and we threw them in bins and we squished them with our feet before putting them in a proper press and turning them into a sweet wine. We don't do that with the rest of our wines, but it's a bit of fun. So that's, oh, there you go. This is the one style of wine that we make where you actually have to squish them quite hard. You can imagine when you've got these raisined grapes trying to make sweet wine, the juice is very syrupy, a bit like sugar syrup. So it takes a lot of squeezing and squishing to get the juice out of those grapes. With all of our other wines, we handle them very, very gently. And we're trying to avoid extracting too much of the bitterness that you can get if you over squish them. So if you jump forward to the next slide, this shows the range of wines that we make at Greywacke. Where you can see my fingers there, that's pointing to the first one that we're going to try very shortly if you haven't already cracked the Sauvignon Blanc open. Just to the next, to the right of that is our Wild Sauvignon. It's also Sauvignon Blanc, but instead of fermenting it in stainless steel tanks, as is tradition in Marlborough, we put all of this into old oak barrels and leave it to ferment with wild yeast. It's a very left field alternate style or take on Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc. Tucked in behind that is our Chardonnay, which we'll also taste. Beside that, our Riesling, which unfortunately we won't show you this evening or this afternoon. Our Botrytis Pinot Gris in the distance. Pinot Gris, which I'm looking forward to tasting and getting your opinions and feedback on. And then finally, the only red wine that we produce at Greywacke is our Pinot Noir. And in Marlborough, we really, as a region, are too cold to ripen other red varieties reliably. I mean, you see a little bit of Syrah, and perhaps with climate change that might increase, but otherwise varieties like Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot, they're typically too thicker skinned and won't reliably ripen. You'll often end up in most years with these very green, weedy, quite awful examples of Cabernet or Merlot. So Pinot Noir, an early ripening, thin-skinned red grape variety, works really well in Marlborough. Okay, what have we got after this one? Tasting. Yay! I think we've earned that.
Yes.
Thanks for. Can I just say thanks to everyone for your patience. Obviously, a minor technical hiccup there, but thanks for rejoining us. This is the fun part, I think. So, if everyone has got their Sauvignon Blanc handy, we're going to taste this wine first. I've just put up in the background just a vineyard shot of one of our Sauvignon Blanc vineyards. While you're pouring your wine, I'm just going to explain a little story too about how we came to access the fruit for Greywacke. So when Kevin was leaving Cloudy Bay at the end of 2008, he bumped into a couple of his former Cloudy Bay colleagues who had left in the early 2000s to set up another winery by the name of Dog Point. And I'm sure, well, actually, I know Dog Point is in Singapore, so you might be familiar with that winery. Well, look, at Dog Point, as I say, there's former colleagues of Kevin's from Cloudy Bay days. They're the largest organic grape grower in New Zealand, the family that is the principal shareholder. And they have a winery that at that time was bigger than what they needed for their own label. So when they heard that Kevin was looking to leave Cloudy Bay, they said, well, look, why don't you come and buy fruit from us? We'll give you your own vineyards, so you can have the same lot every year. We'll let you have them managed however you like. Our viticultural team will do the work. And we've got space in our winery, so why don't you come and make your wine at our winery? So to this day, that's what we still do, in effect. The only difference over the past sort of 10 or 12 years, we've taken on a handful of other growers. And in fact, in the last 2 years, the owner, Ivan Sutherland of Dog Point, he and a group of investors have purchased a neighbouring winery, which was an old rundown winery, which is going through a complete overhaul. And that's going to become the home base for Greywacke. So if you come to Marlborough, come to New Zealand, and you come and visit us, I know the Crystal Wines team would due to come and see us in May. Unfortunately, that's obviously on hold just for the time being. But if anyone else can come and see us, we'll be able to show you around our Greywacke facility. If you need some accommodation, we do have a little bit of quite rustic accommodation in the house at the winery, and we'd love to be able to show you a bit about our vineyards and how we make our wines. So look, Sauvignon Blanc, the style for Marlborough, this is what put New Zealand on the map way back in the mid-1980s, especially with the success of Cloudy Bay and Kevin and his input there. So for this wine, we actually use 10 different vineyard sites from within Marlborough, most of which in the central Wairau Valley, and a little bit towards the southern valleys where I talked about Pinot Noir growing very well. So I guess the big thing that we do that makes us different to a lot of the other Sauvignon Blanc that you'll see on the shelves in Singapore, we spend a lot more time and we pay our growers a lot more money to do some things in the vineyard that most wineries don't do. So we pay our growers a premium to go through in the early part of summer and cut off a lot of their fruit, which you might think sounds totally crazy and counterintuitive. And at the same time, we also get them to remove some of the leaves around the bunches of Sauvignon Blanc grapes. We do that for a very good reason, because if you think of leaves like solar panels and they're pumping, they're capturing all of this solar energy and they're pumping it into less fruit, well, those bunches of Sauvignon Blanc grapes that remain on the vines are going to get more energy compared to if we'd left a huge number of grapes on the vines. So we get more concentration and flavour. And by opening up the canopies and just removing, a handful of leaves around the bunches of grapes, that sunlight breaks down this very characteristic chemical in Sauvignon Blanc grapes called methoxypyrazine. Methoxypyrazine tastes like capsicum or bell pepper, this really green, grassy, herbal characteristic. At Greywacke, we don't particularly like that style of Sauvignon Blanc. We like a softer, richer, riper, and more concentrated style of Sauvignon Blanc. So the way that we achieve that, we use 10 different vineyard sites to build in lots of layers of flavour. But more importantly, We keep the yields very low at around 10 tonnes of fruit per hectare, whereas most people in the region would be around 15 tonnes of fruit per hectare. And we open up the canopy so that you get more sunlight on these Sauvignon Blanc grapes, and that pushes it away from that grassy herbal style of Sauvignon Blanc into a more concentrated, ripe, sort of citrus and stone fruit style of Sauvignon Blanc. Beyond that, it's really simple and quite classic Marlborough winemaking. We pick the fruit at night. Means I've got the lucky job of starting the presses at about 11 p.m. and working through the dark to press this fruit very gently and get that juice into stainless steel tanks, where we, after a few days, we add some very neutral cultured yeast, and we ferment that at cool temperatures over an extended period, and we capture these really intense, vibrant fruit flavors. So what we're looking for with the Greywacke Sauvignon Blanc, as I say, is this concentrated, rich, ripe style with lots of that grapefruit citrus, that peach or nectarine. And in a warmer season like you've got with the 2019, you tend to get more of these melon and slightly passion fruit flavors showing through. As a season, when we had slightly warmer nights in 2019, so the acid levels did drop off a little bit. But again, that suits the style that we're trying to make at Greywacke. We don't want so much acidity. So when you taste the Greywacke Sauvignon Blanc, we want you to appreciate these layers of stone fruit and citrus and melon, but we don't want it to strip the enamel off your teeth. We want this really beautiful, round, rich mouthfeel with just enough acidity to make it feel crisp and dry. But we don't want it to be too zingy or too acidic so that it makes it too hard to go back and enjoy a second glass.
Yeah, I noticed the acidity. It is not that, racy acidity that it's just pleasantly, lightly, just nice.
Yeah, so it's not like biting into a lemon. It doesn't make your eyes squint.
Yeah.
Hopefully, to steal an analogy from the beer industry, and if you've got a more sophisticated example or analogy, I'd love to hear it. But, without trying to make it too simple, to me, this wine becomes a lot more sessionable in that you can enjoy not just one glass, but you can quite happily enjoy a second glass or, a good chunk of the bottle. And it's not, as I say, stripping the enamel on your teeth or being too overwhelming in terms of its flavor profile. It's a slightly more subtle style with more richness and more subtlety, I think, in that wine.
Yeah, balance is the word.
Yeah, so simple winemaking, but very much about diligent viticulture with this wine. And I don't know if we just have a smell and taste of that. If anyone's got questions that you want to talk to specifically about the Sauvignon Blanc, I'm happy to answer them now, or otherwise we can wait for the Q&A session.
Okay, there's no specific question on this wine, but there are some questions for the next wine.
Yeah, I've been spotting the bottom of my screen and I see the word wild flashing up a little bit. So look, when you're ready, look, in an ideal world, if you had two glasses, what's really cool is keeping some of the Sauvignon Blanc in your glass and then pouring the Wild Sauvignon to compare it to. So if you have the fortune of having enough glassware, then keep some of the Sauvignon Blanc in your glass and then next to it, pour some of the Wild Sauvignon. I don't, I've just got one glass. It is nighttime here in New Zealand, so please forgive me, but I am just going to drink the Sauvignon Blanc in my glass.
Yeah, so I think to the participants, it's a very good comparison. You don't drink all the Sauvignon. You drink the Sauvignon Blanc, go to the Wild Sauvignon, and then after that, go back to the Sauvignon Blanc to get that distinct difference. So I really like this Sauvignon Blanc because, like you said, it doesn't have that overpowering capsicum herbaceous notes. And I think that could it also be the reason why you guys abandoned that our Terre Valley? You don't take fruits from...
We did take a little bit of fruit a few years ago from a really beautiful site within the Awatere Valley, and in fact it was quite atypical for that region because it got very ripe and tasted more like Wairau Valley fruit. But that was unusual for the Awatere Valley. We unfortunately no longer have access to that fruit. Excuse me. And so we are left to just continue with the central Wairau Plains. But to be honest, I think from both a logistics and a flavour point of view, it works very, very well with our story and style, just to focus on the Wairau Valley and a little bit into the southern valleys. We're looking for that ripeness and richness, and that's really what our vineyards give us in those locations.
Yeah.
I should point out too, of course, this is the style that most people associate with Marlborough, as you, I'm sure, all know. And at Greywacke, this does account for the largest volume of wine that we make. Out of our, if you were to add up all of our wines, that Sauvignon Blanc probably accounts for about 70% of our wine production. You know, we would love to pull a reliance off that wine and have it more evenly spread, but that is a reflection on what the market expects out of Marlborough. So the next style is the Wild Sauvignon. So to explain the similarities, this is in fact the same fruit by and large and the same juice as is used in the Sauvignon Blanc. But instead of fermenting this juice in stainless steel tanks, we actually put this into mostly old French oak barrels. And as I said in the video, if you caught it earlier on, what we do is we put the juice in the barrels, we stack them up in the cellar, they go 4 barrels high, and we literally do cross our fingers. So in fact, you need to jump forward a slide there. We'll just come back to the Sauvignon Blanc. We cross our fingers and walk away for around about a year. And we, yeah, that's right. Wild Sauvignon. So just one more ahead there, guys. It's the Wild Sauvignon.
One more slide. Yeah.
Yep, that's it. Perfect. Stop there. So look, this Wild Sauvignon is, we call it wild because we're not inoculating the juice. We're literally stacking those barrels up in the cellar, crossing our fingers and hoping that the wild or indigenous yeast that were living on the grapes out in the vineyard that get transferred into the juice as we gently squeeze them will build up a sufficient population to ferment that juice through to dryness. It's, you know, when I studied winemaking 20 years ago, it was very much not what New World winemakers were taught to do. We were much more clinical and more scientific. We would add cultured yeast. We would use temperature-controlled stainless steel tanks. But what I've learned from my time at Greywacke and, you know, taking on board Kevin's experience from Cloudy Bay and his long tenure there is actually, if you've got really beautiful fruit off pristine vineyard sites and you handle it very gently, you can really step back and let nature take its course. And this wine is a really great example of that, where this wild yeast, it tends to give us less predictable flavors and aromas. So we produce usually around 10 different batches, you know, 1 batch from every vineyard site that we source Sauvignon Blanc from. And each one of those different batches gives us quite a different flavor profile. So if one particular batch of wild yeast gets a bit weird and produces a really savory, funky flavor that might be, you know, a little bit out there, well, you've got 9 other batches that generally pull it back into line. So what we find is the temperature of fermentations we can't control. Those barrels are just left to their own devices. So whereas in the Sauvignon Blanc, in that first wine, we're trying to keep the stainless steel temperature tanks down to around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius to slow the fermentation down and to retain those really intense fruity flavors. The Wild Sauvignon can ferment through at around 20 to 25 degrees Celsius. So with those warmer temperatures, you lose the really intense fruitiness, but you gain this much more savory, nutty, floral dimension to the wine. So this spends just under a year in mostly old French oak barrels, and then we need those barrels back for the next harvest. So we take, and from spring, we'll start to identify any of the batches that are going through malolactic fermentation. For those of you that aren't familiar with malolactic fermentation, it's a naturally occurring bacterial fermentation. What it does, if you think of it, like in New Zealand, obviously we eat a lot of apples, and I'm sure you do in Singapore as well, but a green apple is very high in malic acid. It's very tart, quite high in acid. This bacteria converts that green malic acid into a softer, creamier, milkier acid, which is much rounder and creamier and a lot rounder and richer on the palate. So all of the batches that are going through malolactic fermentation, we put into one stainless steel tank. All of the batches that aren't going through, we put into another tank, and we hold those 2 tanks for another 6 to 8 months. before we blend and bottle that wine. So whereas the Sauvignon Blanc, which we tasted first, takes us around 4 months from picking the fruit to putting it into bottle, the Wild Sauvignon, by contrast, takes us around 18 to 20 months from picking to bottling. So it's a very long, slow, hands-off process. It's a very left-field style of Sauvignon Blanc, and we get some people describing it to us as the Chardonnay drinkers Sauvignon Blanc. And, you know, we make a much smaller quantity of this style of Sauvignon because it is a little bit newer. It's not necessarily what people expect out of Marlborough, but we, you know, if we had to pick a signature wine for Greywacke, we would have to say the Wild Sauvignon, because it is a classic grape variety for our region, but very much a unique Greywacke twist on this variety. You know, it's a style of Sauvignon Blanc that you can drink in its youth, but unusually, and we know this now from extensive vertical tastings around the world, if you put this wine away in the cellar, if you're disciplined, unlike me, I tend to drink the wines pretty quickly. If you put this wine away in the cellar, it actually gets better with age. And when we taste back to our 2009 or 2010, our first vintage or two, and we ask a room to stick up their hand and say, which vintage would you take home and drink tonight? It's often those earlier vintages. So it's a very, very interesting, exciting, arguably more food-friendly style of Sauvignon Blanc. And I think it's got a great future for Greywacke, albeit in smaller volumes.
So, you know, Richard, the question always about screw caps, since you are at the topic of aging potential. Yeah, can you enlighten our participants today that, you know, screw cap wines can age? That's no problem. Because the perception is really, if people buy a screw cap wine, they think that, okay, it has to be drunk young now.
Look, I'll give you that's a great question, Amy. Thank you. And I'll share a little story. So I was in London. I used to live there for a period of time, and I was at a tasting, a 10-year vertical tasting of a particular New Zealand winery. And I was looking at the Chardonnay vertical tasting, and all of these wines are under cork. And the more recent vintages looked really good and fresh. And as you got back towards that 6, 7, 8 year mark, these wines, they weren't corked, but they had a cork influence in the flavor. And personally, I don't really like that. And, you know, it was when I was getting into winemaking in the early 2000s in New Zealand, that as an industry in New Zealand, we'd been subjected to really poor quality corks from the Portuguese suppliers, even though we were paying really good money for quality corks. In the worst case, we would see up to 15% of our wines having to be thrown out through cork taint. And I don't know any other industry that would tolerate that amount of wastage. So we said, look, that's not acceptable. And wholeheartedly, as an industry, we've embraced screw cap. And I have to admit, early on in the piece, I was a little bit skeptical. It took a little while for winemakers to understand how to make wines to be bottled under screw caps so they didn't taste a little bit stinky. But as we've got our heads around it, and as I've tasted numerous vertical tastings of not only white wines, but red wines as well under screw cap, I would argue that screw cap is the equivalent of a really good quality cork. So there is certainly evolution that takes place under screw cap. It probably takes place a little bit more slowly than a cork in most instances, but the one advantage is it's much more consistent. So whereas a good cork is amazing, and who doesn't love the sound of a popping of a cork, the problem is when you've put that wine away in your cellar for 10, 15, 20 years, you pull it out, and if the cork's not crumbly, the wine's got TCA or cork taint, well, at least under screw cap, it's highly unlikely that you'll have that same issue. So I think it's a real positive, and probably we're starting to see, I can't speak for Singapore, but in markets like the USA, which have traditionally been very much against screw cap, they are changing in quite a big way. And you're starting to see regions, wine-producing regions like Chianti in Italy, who are now permitting the use of screw caps, as I think they realise the technology is worth considering.
Okay, so there's this question, since we're at Wild Sauvignon, whether it has an aging potential of up to 15 years. I think yes. What do you think?
Well, look, it's a little bit of crystal ball gazing because our first vintage is '09. So what are we? We've had 12 vintages now. I would say yes. Probably the first two vintages of our Wild Sauvignon, I think, have peaked. The '09, I think, depending on the day, either looks like it's at its peak or it sometimes looks like it's just past it. I do think, though, as we've got our heads around how to make the Wild Sauvignon, that and particularly in certain vintages, you'll see that it will quite easily go to 15 years. Our 2011 vintage, for example, I think looks relatively youthful. And I think, as a 9-year-old Sauvignon Blanc, I think that's easily got another 5 to 10 years life in it. I think it's a pretty exciting style. So yes, I think, these wines can age, and I would like to think that 15 years is pretty achievable.
Okay. And is Wild Sauvignon Blanc similar style to Tecoco, but at a better price point? Very
pricing.
sensitive question, but Tecoco is one of Kevin Judd's baby too, right?
Well, look, of course, as we like to do, we like to be very respectful to Cloudy Bay because they are great friends of ours. But as a price, and to be honest, crystal wines are a better place to answer about pricing. I have noticed that they typically sit a little bit higher than the Greywacke wines. Look, when Kevin left Cloudy Bay, he took all of his favourite things. So his favourite barrel producer, as he said in the video. So rather than buying from, say, 5 or 10 different barrel suppliers, we just buy from one barrel supplier. It was Kevin's favourite from Cloudy Bay days. Really fantastic barrel producer from the south of Burgundy, and Mercury, for those of you that know where Mercury is. And in terms of the wine styles, and especially or in particular the Wild Sauvignon versus Tecoco, I don't know how Tecoco is made now, but the way it used to be made is that it would spend 18 months in oak, and the entire blend would go through malolactic fermentation. So when Kevin set up the style of Wild Sauvignon, he wanted to make it a little bit tighter and a little bit fresher with more fruit than Tecoco. So rather than spending 18 months in oak, we spend just under 12 months in oak, plus an extended period in stainless steel tanks. And also, rather than letting the full blend go through malolactic fermentation, which makes it that really creamy, soft, round style of Sauvignon Blanc, we allow about 2/3 of this wine to go through malolactic fermentation. So they were two key differences in the approach to making Wild Sauvignon versus the Tecoco. So it is a slightly different style, and I think a slightly tighter, fruitier version compared to Tecoco.
Prettier, yeah. Okay, I think let's proceed to the next wine.
Yeah. Let's taste some Chardonnay. I'll tell you what, so you might have had on the list here Pinot Gris next, but I would recommend trying the Chardonnay if you haven't already poured your Pinot Gris. Is everyone okay with that if we go Chardonnay next?
Yeah, that's the sequence, Chardonnay.
Yeah, sorry, that's, yeah. We're going, basically, with the Pinot Gris, it's a little bit sweeter, so we tend to do our dry wines first and then just do the wine with a little bit of sweetness next. So if you just go back to that vineyard for a second, whoever's got control there, thank you. So this is our Simmerland vineyard. If you remember the map of the Marlborough sub-regions, you saw this in the central part of the Wairau Valley. This is in fact a stony old riverbed. It's a vineyard that's right between, if you looked to the left of the screen, you'd see the Cloudy Bay Winery, and if you look to the right of the screen, you would see Kevin and Kimberly's old house and the original Greywacke vineyard that they developed. This is what we call our Simmerlands vineyard. It is planted on an old riverbed, so underneath this grass is a really stony soil structure. It's really free draining. It's one of my favorite Chardonnay vineyards, and we get this really intense flavored fruit from this particular vineyard. For the Greywacke Chardonnay, we use 5 different vineyard sites. We've got the Simmerlands vineyard, and then we've got 4 others sort of moving south towards the southern valleys. We handpick all of this fruit. We bring it into the winery. We press it really gently. And in most vintages, we press about half of the juice directly from the press into oak barrels. The other half we put into a stainless steel tank overnight and we let it settle. You get all of this kind of dust and sediment drop to the bottom of the tank, and we pump the clearer juice into barrel the next day. And the reason we do have those two different approaches, the cloudy juice straight from the press and the clear juice that we settle over 24 hours, is that the cloudy juice tends to give us a smoky, flinty layer of complexity to the wine, and then the clearer juice that is settled overnight gives us a cleaner, fruitier element or dimension to the wine. And across the board with the Greywacke wines, we're trying to build up these layers of flavour and aroma. So you can skip to the next slide there. So this wine is a little bit similar to the Wild Sauvignon in that we put it into barrel. They're mostly old barrels. About 20% of these barrels are new. And we stack these barrels up in the cellar again, cross our fingers. But this time we walk away for 18 months. So it's a longer period in oak. As I say, those oak barrels are mostly old. So unlike the Chardonnay examples that used to come from New Zealand and Australia in the late 80s and through the 90s, which had 50, 80, sometimes 100% new oak, we're only 20% new oak. We're using a particular clone of Chardonnay grapes that allows us to get it really ripe and concentrated, but also maintains very high natural acidity. And with this particular style of Chardonnay, we want this range of rich kind of grapefruit, citrus, nectarine, peach kind of flavors in terms of the fruit spectrum. We want these brioche, roasted hazelnuts, creamy, nutty kind of elements, a bit of smokiness from the oak. But one of the key attributes is that we want this very fine natural acidity to just underpin this wine, to give it length on the palate, and to really clean it up and give it a degree of freshness that some of those older styles of Chardonnay didn't necessarily have. So it's arguably, Kevin, and my favourite wine to make and to drink.
Favorite Chardonnay.
I love Chardonnay, and in New Zealand we're starting to see a bit of a renaissance for Chardonnay. I think the thing is, unlike those big oaky buttery styles of Chardonnay of the late 80s and 90s, for a period of time in the early 2000s, people moved across to the other extreme and tried unoaked Chardonnays, and they found that by and large they were pretty boring. We've come back to this happy median where it's a very careful amount of new oak. As I say, we want this really good amount of fresh acidity, and we like the range of flavors. And in Marlborough in particular, we get this lovely citrus, stone fruit range of flavors and aromas, and I think it makes for a really outstanding Chardonnay. So while people know us for Sauvignon Blanc, I think we need to explain to more people that Chardonnay is also an exceptional variety for our region.
But do you have enough vineyards for Chardonnay in Marlborough?
No, to be sure. Short answer is no. And I mentioned this particular clone, which we call Mendoza, which we can get very ripe, and it unusually also retains very high natural acid. It's unfortunately a very irregular cropping clone. So some years you'll get lots of fruit and some years you'll get almost no fruit. And so grape growers historically have really disliked that, because if they were, by most companies, getting paid by the ton, obviously if they don't have any fruit to sell, the wineries, they're not going to get paid. So they didn't like it. They ripped out a lot of the vineyards and planted Sauvignon Blanc. But thankfully we've had access to these really beautiful, 20, 25-year-old, mature, predominantly organically grown blocks of Mendoza clone Chardonnay. And we're making this really beautiful, well, I think beautiful, you might have a different opinion, beautiful, rich, layered style of Chardonnay that, as I say, has that really lovely acidity to underpin it.
Yeah, agree. Very nice Chardonnay.
Yeah.
I like that it doesn't have that too overly MLF character.
Yeah,
right.
And that's a point with that malolactic or MLF character that you're talking about, Amy. So often you'll see this overt or intense buttery popcorn kind of character. We really dislike that as well. So in fact, when this wine is getting ready for blending, and before we get it ready for bottling, we actually do a bit of lees stirring where we mix up the dead yeast cells, and what that does is it tends to get rid of that buttery popcorn characteristic. And once we're sure that that flavor's disappeared, then we get it ready for bottling. So we don't like it either.
Okay, good. Let's proceed to Pinot Gris.
Great.
Can we? Yeah.
Thank you. So this is one of 3 Pinot Gris vineyards that we have historically used in this wine. So in New Zealand, unlike a lot of other markets like Australia, for example, where some of their growers call their Pinot Gris, and some of their growers and winemakers call their wines Pinot Grigio. In New Zealand, almost without exception, we've labelled this as Pinot Gris, even though it's the same grape variety as Pinot Grigio. It's more of a reference to the style of wine that we're trying to make. So, you know, if you've tried Italian Pinot Grigio, you know, if you're sitting on a boat in the Mediterranean, to be honest, a crisp, dry Pinot Grigio could be quite lovely. But we're, you know, we have this intense fruitiness in Marlborough and in New Zealand generally, to be fair. And so we like to make the most of that fruitiness. And so we're making a style at Greywacke that's really rich. It's quite ripe. Well, it's a lot riper than most. In fact, we pay our growers by the hectare. So we do that because we want them to cut off a significant amount of crop. So again, like with the Sauvignon Blanc, you get more concentration of flavor. We hang this fruit out on the vineyards for a very, very long time, to the point where even though the growers are getting paid by the hectare, we still field phone calls from them towards the end of the season saying, when are you going to pick our fruit? When are you going to pick our fruit? And it's like, guys, relax. We've already paid you for it, even without picking it. So we hang it out for a long time because we've come to realize that with Pinot Gris, in order to get lots of flavor, it's in the last stages of ripening that you get this really beautiful intensity of flavor. Often we find in Pinot Gris, and you know, some New Zealand Pinot Gris, it can be quite bland and quite neutral and a little bit watery. And I think that's often because they've overcropped the vines or they've picked it too early. So we really don't want that. And I mentioned earlier, you know, in the video that when I joined Greywacke, one of the first things Kevin said to me was, if you wish to experiment with any of the wines, then by all means go for it. Keep them posted and let's discuss it. But Pinot Gris probably the best example where we handpick the fruit from these 3 vineyard sites at high ripeness levels. We squeeze it incredibly gently. Unlike when I studied winemaking, where you would use sulfur and you would use gas to stop this fruit going, or the juice going brown. You know, like if you bite an apple, leave it on the bench, and after 5-10 minutes, the apple goes brown. It's exact same with grape juice in the press. But we've come to realize that because we use a lot of wild yeast fermentation across the range of Greywacke wines, that the air contact or that oxygen gives healthier fermentations. And so we squeeze these grapes. We don't protect them with gas or sulfur. We let them go brown. We put 2/3 of this wine into old French oak barrels, at least 5 years old. The balance, about 1/3, we put into stainless steel tanks, and we inoculate that tank to give us the really intensely pear, apple, quince kind of fruity flavor and aroma profile. And though the larger portion of the blend, which has gone into those old oak barrels, again, like the Wild Sauvignon and Chardonnay, we just put into a barrel hall, stack them up, and let the wild yeast do their job. And it gives us this more nutty, savory, spicy dimension. So by the time we come to blend those 2 components together, we think we have a much more layered, rich, interesting style of Pinot Gris. So it is off dry. There's around about 9 or 10 grams of residual sugar in this wine. We don't leave that sugar in there for sweetness as such, but what it does do is it gives us a little bit of extra weight on the palate. And, you know, in terms of wine and food, you know, I know in Singapore you've got some beautiful spicy characteristics. This wine, because it's got a touch of that residual sugar, it can cope with a little bit of chili spice. And as such, we find it an incredibly versatile style of wine. So we stop it with a little bit of sugar, and it rests in barrels for another 6, sometimes up to 12 months before we get it ready for bottling. So quite an atypical, unusual style of Pinot Gris for New Zealand. We're quite happy with that. We're not sort of at the behest of an accountant, so we're quite happy to make this more left field style of Pinot Gris, and we've developed quite a following for it, to be honest. Hopefully you've enjoyed that style. It is a little bit different. It is a little bit sweet. Not too sweet, hopefully.
Not too sweet, actually. I've tasted much sweeter, much off-dry Pinot Gris.
Yeah, and in New Zealand you do get quite a spectrum. We're off dry. You do get some people producing some really luscious, very sweet Pinot Gris. A lot producing that very bone dry style. We're just looking for a rich, opulent, weighty, concentrated style of Pinot Gris with lots of that pear and quince fruit flavors, maybe some cinnamon, ginger kind of spices in there, and then this nutty, savory element from the wild fermentation.
So perhaps the next slide, Cheryl, so the participants can take a look at the technical part.
Yeah. So I think, as I've mentioned, 3 vineyard sites. We handpicked this. It's very, very gently pressed. And the majority of it's fermented using wild yeast in old French oak barrels. I've put that most of the time it spends around 6 months in oak. So we stop when we come to stop the ferment. So when we think the sugar and acid balance is about right, we take the component from barrel, we put that into a stainless steel tank with the other stainless steel tank components. So it's all in one big tank, one big blend. We turn the cooling on, that kills the yeast, they drop to the bottom, and we put all of that wine back into old barrels, and we leave it anywhere from 6 months, and occasionally we'll leave it as long as 12 months in oak, just to kind of come together as a blend and become really homogeneous, and spend a bit of time resting on in these old oak barrels. And it's really to build this richness of flavour, which we think balances that really intense fruit that we tend to get from our Pinot Gris. It's a style that, in fact, is a variety. It's the second most popular variety in New Zealand behind Sauvignon Blanc. So very, very important wine for us.
So basically, you guys are pretty much wild all the way. Wild Chardonnay, wild Pinot Gris.
Yeah, and I saw a comment, and thanks to whoever posted the question, I saw about, have you thought about a wild Chardonnay and a wild Pinot Noir?
Yeah.
In fact, the Chardonnay and Pinot are wild fermented. The Pinot Gris is 2/3 wild fermented. Our Riesling is half wild fermented. Even the Sauvignon Blanc that we had first, while most of it comes from stainless steel tanks with a cultured yeast, we do blend around about 10 to 15% wild fermentation Sauvignon Blanc, wild Sauvignon back into that blend, just to enhance the creaminess and richness. So there is a wild influence across all of the wines in the Greywacke range. We think, as I said earlier, in New Zealand, when I studied winemaking, and certainly when Kevin did at Roseworthy in Australia, we were taught, both of us were taught this very scientific, prescriptive, New World approach to winemaking. But I have to say, in the last sort of 15, 20 years, more and more we're seeing that rule book tossed away as we gain confidence as winemakers that we can use techniques like wild ferment and old oak barrels to make more and more interesting wine. So I think it's a really exciting period in New World winemaking in New Zealand, at least. And I think the wines are just getting better as a result.
Yeah, and I agree with you. The long hanging time, the intensity of the fruit, and it's really pretty much blessed by the region itself, right? Because you were saying Marlborough is shielded from rain, so you can hang it for as long as.
Yeah, and look, Pinot Gris is a really amazing grape variety. This is our 2017 Pinot Gris. And in all honesty, 2017 was a pretty challenging season for some of our varieties. Sauvignon Blanc, if you weren't diligent and you kept your crops really high, which, as I said, we don't at Greywacke, then often, then in that season, they were trying to pick their fruit when we had some storms come through, so it wasn't ideal. We, without wanting to sound smug, that's not the point. It's more about you know, when you are careful and you keep your crops low, then your fruit tends to ripen. It ripens a bit earlier, and you can get it in the winery before any bad weather comes through. Well, to be honest and to be fair to the other growers, our Pinot Gris, which we do crop at a very low level, it is a later ripening variety compared to the Sauvignon Blanc. We left this fruit hanging for a long, long time, and even going through a couple of big rain events, the fruit just looked pristine. It is, you know, our particular growers do an incredible job at making, you know, at allowing this fruit to ripen and just look absolutely perfect post. Thanks to whoever's leaving there from Chris. Oh, Chris, thank you.
Sorry, we overrun a bit. I think we can probably close the session within 15 minutes, right?
Yeah.
So sorry to other participants.
Sorry for dragging it on for those of you that have to leave. We can speed this up. But look, the point of the Pinot Gris is the fruit is amazing. It can cope with a bit of weather, and the 2017 Pinot Gris looked absolutely superb, given some challenging conditions. Who's ready for Pinot Noir? Should we have a taste?
Yep.
Last wine. So the Yerm Vineyard. This is, as I say, this is the vineyard that's behind me. At least from the photo here, you can see that it is, if you look at those people picking the grapevines, it is a very steep vineyard. I can tell you that when we put nets over, because in New Zealand we have birds that like to live near the vineyards during the ripening season, as soon as they see the Pinot Noir grapevines turn black, or the bunches of grapes turn black, they think, great, it's time to go and eat the grapes. So we have to put these big nets that cover, you know, 3 or 4 rows at a time. And when I've got to clamber under these nets to take samples to work out when we're going to pick this fruit, it gets pretty hot in those 30 degree temperatures walking up and down those rows. So, but it is a really wonderful vineyard site, planted with a mixture of different clones of Pinot Noir. The vineyard itself is about 20 years old, so it's starting to settle down and give us these really lovely, stable, mature flavors and aromas. I'm just going to pour some Pinot Noir now. So this is our 2017 Pinot. So I mentioned it was a challenging season. It was challenging more so for the whites, but for Pinot Noir, which is the first variety that we picked, this was a stunning year. I'm really proud of this wine. So I mentioned earlier that, you know, historically Marlborough has been known for these very pale, light bodies, strawberry, raspberry, quite watery examples of Pinot Noir, and that's because we grew them, the Pinot Noir grapevines down on those gravelly, Greywacke soils of the Wairau Valley where Sauvignon Blanc and Chardonnay do particularly well, but it's terrible for Pinot Noir as it turns out. So about 25 years ago, we started exploring the southern valleys, these hillside regions on clay soils. We imported better clones of Pinot Noir grapevines from Burgundy, the spiritual home of Pinot Noir. Fast forward 25 years and we've got vine age and we've got winemaker experience. And the end result is we're producing these darker, richer, more spicy styles of Pinot. And finally, you know, the international wine community is starting to understand that Marlborough is a serious contender when it comes to New World Pinot Noir. You know, compared to somewhere like Central Otago, if you're familiar with New Zealand Pinot Noir, who have carved out a name for themselves, not only for the Lord of the Rings trilogy and the movie series, with their spectacular, quite mountainous alpine environment, they produce this very black-fruited, quite muscular style of Pinot Noir, generally. By contrast, in Marlborough, you know, we're close to the ocean, we're growing on clay soils, we produce a more ethereal, more pretty, more silky, supple style of Pinot Noir that's more in that red fruit spectrum, albeit in that darker, you know, like plum or red cherry kind of spicy style. So it's exciting because it's quite unique to Marlborough. This Yarram vineyard that we source most of our Pinot Noir vineyard, Yarram sounds exotic. If you flick Yarram around the other way, it actually just spells Murray. The original family that owned this block was the Murray family. I think Yarram sounds a bit better. So it's an organically grown vineyard. It supplies most of the fruit for this wine. And we have a couple of other satellite vineyards in the southern valleys grown on the hills that also supply a bit of fruit for our Pinot Noir. We hand pick it, we bring it into the winery, it goes into a big fridge overnight, and then arguably the most boring job you could ever hope to do the next day is stand around a sorting table. So around 6 to 8 of us stand either side of a conveyor belt, and every single bunch of Pinot Noir grapes that have been picked rolls down this conveyor belt. Anything that we are not prepared to put in our mouths, the rule is we put that into a bin behind us that goes on the compost heap, and everything else we put into either the destemmer, which removes the berries from the stems, or for about 20% of the fruit, we push that destemmer out of the way, and the fruit just trundles on down the conveyor belt into a bin at the end. We take those bins, we carefully tip them into these open top stainless steel tanks. We wait for the wild yeast to build up a big enough population to start fermenting that juice and turning it into wine. We gently plunge this wine up to just once per day while it's fermenting. And then after about 2 to 3 weeks on skins, we drain that wine off, press the skins, and the whole lot goes to about a third new French oak barrels for 18 months. So the winemaking is pretty traditional. We do include about 20, in some years up to 30% whole bunch fruit, which enhances that spicy floral character. And it's more about the fact that we've got these beautiful organic hillside vineyards on clay soils, which is giving this darker, richer, spicy style of Pinot Noir. So look, I'm really proud of this wine as a style, and this particular vintage I think shows very, very well. In fact, the one change that I've made since I joined Greywacke is we've dialed back the amount of new oak that we use in this wine. It used to be 40% new oak, and with Kevin's blessing as such, we've dialed that back to around 30 to 35% new oak.
The reason why you dial it back is because of the vintage? Because it's...
Look, for me, I think Pinot Noir is all about elegance. It's a pretty ethereal wine. It shouldn't be big and muscular like a Cabernet Sauvignon. I think it looks better as an elegant, ethereal, pretty style. And to help that, I think we actually need to have less of that obvious smoky oak. So we dialed back the amount of smoky oak, and we just brought back the total amount of new oak back to about a third new. And what we see is just a bit more elegance. And I think that's a really positive trait with this wine. So that's one of the things that I've changed in my time at Greywacke, and Kevin's been completely on board with that, which has been really fantastic. The only other thing that we've changed is that like a lot of Pinot Noir producers, we're experimenting with increasing the amount of whole bunch fruit where we don't remove the berries from the stems. And those stems, as I mentioned, tend to give us more of the spicy floral characteristics. So that a couple of things that we're experimenting with and every year we chop and change depending on the season. So hopefully making a better and better wine. So an exciting wine style. Hopefully you enjoy that too.
Yeah, I enjoyed it. In fact, the Pinot Noir is the favorite of our private sales team. They love the Pinot Noir. They were telling me, oh, if I want to have a nice cup, is a replacement for a nice cup of coffee, I'll get the Pinot Noir. Because it does have that earthiness and that coffee notes. Yeah. So Levi is there. Yeah, that's one of her favorite Pinot Noir.
Great.
So good. So what's the next slide?
Well, I guess if there's any questions and answers, now's the time to put them forward. But again, just thank you to everyone who's participated. I know some of you have probably realised that this has gone on longer than you anticipated. I have a tendency to talk, so I'm sorry about that. But
we're also very sorry.
Yeah, if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate to put them forward.
Yeah, I think there's one question about the Sauvignon Blanc, whether you practice skin contact. Maybe you can talk about both, Sauvignon Blanc and the Wild Sauvignon Blanc.
Yeah, good question. Not actively. So we pick our Sauvignon Blanc by machine primarily, except for a couple of hillside vineyards where we hand pick it. And when you machine pick Sauvignon Blanc, you do get a little bit of skin contact, but when we bring that fruit into the winery, we're not actively looking to leave the juice on skin or on skins for an extended period. A lot of Marlborough wineries are trialing that. It's just not something that we feel that we need to for the style that we're trying to make. I guess the one thing that I'm really wary of when you produce white wines that have had extended skin contact is you can get quite a bitter phenolic influence in the wine, and that's something that we're trying to avoid. So no, at Greywacke we don't tend to do extended skin contact.
There's a question regarding the Wild Sauvignon. How do you keep rogue microbes in control for Wild Sauvignon? What's the percentage of success?
We cross both our fingers. No, honestly, there is very little that we can do. And when I first joined Greywacke, I was a bit nervous about this approach. But as I say, I've come to understand and appreciate that if you have pristine fruit, as I say, most of which, not all of our wine is organic, so we can't put it on the label as organic. One day we will, hopefully. When you grow most of your fruit organically, you press it very gently. You allow a lot of oxygen during that pressing process. As I mentioned, we've come to realize that oxygen and air is the friend of yeast. It helps them develop more healthy yeast cells. You can put those batches of Wild Sauvignon away, and in most cases, they ferment pretty successfully. I do have to admit, in the first two vintages, Kevin had a couple of batches that didn't go completely dry. The wild yeast just ran out of puff, and so he very reluctantly bottled that wine with a little bit more sugar than he anticipated. But as it turns out, over time, it looks really great, and the feedback's been amazing. So we have very little control, but we've got enough experience now to know that the risk is worth it. And in most cases, the wines ferment pretty successfully. If you were to look under a microscope, in the early part of those wild yeast fermentations, it's not a single strain of yeast that you'll see under a microscope. There's probably 15 to 20 different strains of yeast and bacteria, all trying to grow and do their thing. And we think that that's really important, that they're all adding this savory wild influence to the wine. But as the alcohol level builds up, as that sugar gets consumed and alcohol gets produced, what you find is that there's just one single wine yeast strain that's left to ferment that juice through to dryness. And if you're familiar with the concept of terroir, you know, the French concept of place and people, and you know, all of these natural impacts that influence the style of wine. Well, we would argue that the wild yeasts that live in our vineyards are part of our terroir, and they have a big influence on the style and flavour of our wines that we produce at Greywacke.
There's this question that was sent privately. How is indigenous yeast different from the rest, which I believe he meant cultured yeast?
Yeah, and again, a good question. I think, to be honest, the indigenous yeast, you'll see a much broader range of indigenous yeast at the start of that ferment. They are typically less alcohol tolerant. They tend to give us more of these, like a much wider range of flavors, more in that savory spectrum than a commercial cultured yeast. But by the end of the alcoholic fermentation, we've probably got the same strain of yeast, that Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is this is the same strain that you would see both in our wild fermentation as what you might see in a laboratory. So I should point out that the laboratory yeast are effectively where a lab over in France or Germany have taken wild yeast, they've found a particular strain that they like, and they've just propagated that. So it does, you know, effectively they do all derive from the wild. It's just that in our fermentations, we've not only got that strain of yeast that is alcohol tolerant, we've got a bunch of others that start the ferment but then die off pretty quickly.
What's the impact of global warming to Greywacke now and in the immediate future?
Yeah, look, at the moment, it's not too much of a problem. We did have a really dry, in fact, we've had 2 very dry seasons in a row. It's quite topical in New Zealand at the moment. We're talking a lot about climate change, partly through sea level rise, which is probably of concern to the vineyards closer to the coast in Marlborough. For Greywacke, and if I just put a Marlborough hat on as a region, I think probably the biggest thing that we're going to need to look at or consider is water storage. So we had a French scientist through last year, and he was talking to us about, you know, the projections for climate change on agriculture and horticulture in New Zealand. And the take-home message was, we're likely not necessarily to get hotter, but what we will see is different rainfall patterns. So we might have rain during the growing season, right when we don't need it. And we'll have no rain when we actually need it, when the vines are really thirsty. So really the take-home message is that we need to consider building dams and water storage. It's not having an immediate impact on the grapes at Greywacke, but it is something that we're conscious of. And I think as a region and as a wine growing region, we're going to have to look at strategies for the future. And a lot of that will be on water storage for irrigation and probably also for frost control.
Okay, last question from our participant, very technical. For the wild ferments, what is the average temperature for fermentation?
Look, a typical range of fermentation for that wild fermentation would be probably between 18 to 23 degrees Celsius. As I say, in our barrel hall, we actually have very little control over the temperature. And while, as I say, when I first joined Greywacke, I would have been a bit stressed out or concerned by that, I've come to realize that it doesn't really matter. The yeast will build up a temperature. The oak barrels hold that temperature pretty well. And so you'll often find them in that 18 to 23 degree range. Occasionally, if you climb to the top of the barrel stack, you might find the odd barrel that's really active and really fermenting quite vigorously, and that might be closer to 25 degrees Celsius, but that's probably at the more extreme end of the spectrum.
And the key is really to be a bit warmer than the fermentation temperature. I mean, higher temperature than the regular.
Correct. Wild yeast, that's a good point. Wild yeast are typically less temperature tolerant than cultured yeast, so we do encourage them to be a little bit warmer because they're more likely to be healthy and successful in fermenting that juice through to dryness.
I think I missed some questions, but so Chris was asking about the age worthiness. So we mentioned about Wild Sauvignon, and then he also asked about Chardonnay and Pinot Noir as well. So I believe these are all age worthiness.
So Chardonnay, I think we've got, probably almost the greatest age worthiness. I think maybe even more so than the Wild Sauvignon. It's got lots of acidity, it's got lots of richness. It ages, as I mentioned earlier, a little bit more slowly under screw cap than you might see under cork. I think the Chardonnay has got, the potential maybe 10 to 20 years. It's again crystal ball gazing because we haven't been around for long enough to know at Greywacke, but I would hope that if you pulled a bottle of 20-year-old Greywacke Chardonnay open in the future, that it would still look pretty, moderately fresh and a pretty pleasant wine to drink. Pinot Noir, I think, is a bit more subjective. I tend to like it when it's got a bit more of that primary fruit, and I often find in that sort of 5 to 10 year mark, before it develops these more savoury characteristics, that for me that's a sweet spot for drinking Pinot Noir, but it depends entirely on the style that you like drinking. Not all Pinot Noirs, but sometimes or quite often you'll see they'll, as I say, develop after sort of 10 years or so, you'll start seeing more of the savoury character kick in and less of the primary fruit. And if you like that, great, it'll keep going for maybe another 5-10 years. But for me, 5 to 10 years is a bit of a sweet spot. I love that intensity of primary fruit.
So it's really a matter of preference rather than the risk of oxidation.
Yeah, look, I think
no oxidation actually. There's no screw cap.
Yeah, look, unless the screw cap has been banged and damaged, then generally they're pretty inert. Look, the red wines still do evolve, and they will eventually, I guess, oxidize, but that will take a little bit longer than under cork. So it is really more about what style of Pinot you like to drink.
Diana asked if you will consider making wines outside of Marlborough.
No, not for Greywacke. Look, our ethos is to make the best Marlborough wine that we can. And you might have noticed that we don't talk about single vineyards. It's not really our mantra or ethos. What we're about is making the best Marlborough wine that we can. So, no, you won't see us stray from the region. In fact, one of the things I didn't talk about was on our Sauvignon Blanc. If you have a look, if you get the chance to look at our 2019 Sauvignon Blanc bottle, on the back of it is a little logo that says AMW. It's Appellation Marlborough Wine, and that's a new appellation system that's kicked in. It's a voluntary appellation, and it's about celebrating and protecting the image of really good quality Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc at this stage. All of the fruit has to be from Marlborough. The wine has to be bottled in New Zealand. You have to keep your yields at a particular level or below. And that kind of fits with the Greywacke mindset of all about like the best for Marlborough. So at this stage, I would reasonably confidently say that we won't be looking outside the region for Greywacke.
Okay. Honestly, we're getting a stream of questions, but I think let's put a stop to this, and I will ask the question to separately, and let's see how we can answer them back via email, because I think we are overrunning, but very enthusiastic participants, very happy. So I think any last words, Richard? Otherwise, let's end the session with a video.
Yeah, look, hey, well, I guess the biggest thing is to say thanks again to everyone, both for participating in the first place, but also for listening to me talk for an extended period. Crystal Wines, you guys are, you're doing such a fantastic job, and we appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you.
I hope you all keep safe up there in Singapore, and I certainly look forward to visiting. Likewise, once the borders open up and you do get the chance, or if you have the desire to travel to New Zealand, don't hesitate to get in touch. You can find us at greywacke.com, or you can get in touch with Crystal Wines, and they've got our contact details. And as Amy said, if you've got questions, if there's something that you really wanted to ask but we haven't got to this evening, or this afternoon rather, please pass them on to Amy or the team at Crystal Wines. I'd really love to answer them. It's no hassle. They've got my email address, and I'm happy to come back to you. So thanks for drinking our wines. Thanks for participating. I think we're going to leave you with one last little 4-minute video for Greywacke. So thanks again.
Most restaurant wine lists in the world have a Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc now. It's become a benchmark by which other Sauvignon Blancs are judged in the world. So when I first came to Marlborough in 1985, Marlborough Sauvignon Blanc really was just sort of becoming discovered around the world. It's incredible now to see the extent of the plantings. So I feel very fortunate to have been part of Cloudy Bay for 25 years. I was in charge of winemaking, and then in 2009, Kimberly and I decided to establish our own business. I quit the day job in the middle of a financial crisis and started Greywacke. Greywacke is it's a geological term for very hard sedimentary rock that is basically the foundation of New Zealand. I was absolutely selfish with how I went about making the wines. I chose my favourite barrel and my favourite sort of percentage of whole clusters. And
one of the first things Kevin said when I joined Greywacke was, with regards to winemaking, if you want to experiment with any of the wines, then by all means, obviously keep them posted. It's a really refreshing, very open-minded approach to winemaking. Things that I've probably picked up on working with Kevin is what not to worry about with the winemaking. It is that take a step back and let nature take its course.
people talk about the terroir of a wine district being the combination of the climate and the soils. People also these days are referring perhaps to the human influence as well as being part of the terroir. But I'd like to think that the microflora of a region is also part of that terroir. It's specific to Marlborough.
And provided the fruit's sound and you've done all of the, dotted the I's and crossed the T's earlier on in the winemaking process, you can relax and you often end up with a much more interesting wine as a result. So the Greywacke Sauvignon Blanc is really rich, ripe, concentrated style of Sauvignon. It's less about green, grassy, herbaceous flavours and more in that softer, riper sort of style. The Wild Sauvignon is a much softer, richer, more savoury example of Sauvignon Blanc. It's arguably quite a left field style, and it's a really age-worthy style. You can put it in the cellar and it will drink well in 5 to 10 years' time at least.
But I think now people are realising that Chardonnay, if it's handled in a subtle way, produces absolute world-class wine.
So it's creamy and nutty and rich, but really, really fine acidity. The Greywacke Riesling, it's the only single vineyard wine that we produce. It's an organic certified block. Flavour-wise, it's about producing a really limey citrus style of Riesling. Pinot Gris typically gives us these quite pear and quince oriented flavours, and we certainly get lots of that. It's a style that we pick really, really ripe. We're looking for richness, ripeness, really, really concentrated flavours. We ferment a lot of this in old oak barrels with wild yeast, so it adds a slightly savoury dimension to that wine. Pinot Noir, this is probably the variety that I'm most excited about.
You put your nose in a glass of great New Zealand Pinot Noir and you see something that you'll never see in Burgundy.
About 20 years ago, we started planting up on the hillsides. By importing better clones from Burgundy, and now Vine Age and Winemaker experience, we're making these much richer, darker, very supple styles of Pinot, and it's quite a unique Marlborough flavour that we're starting to see emerge.
I look forward to the day when the world discovers Marlborough Chardonnay and Pinot Gris and Riesling and those sort of things, because there's a whole world of Marlborough wine that's yet to be discovered.
I guess the ambition from my point of view is to make incremental changes each year to make a better and better wine.
Greywacke has over-delivered on my expectations. We're now exporting to 40 countries, to anywhere from London to Tanzania to Newfoundland to Norway.
Okay. That slide, Cheryl. Dinah, can we get everyone to take a photo now?
We do a grid view
Yeah.
or something?
Yeah. Can we have everyone flaunt your best ever pose, and let's take a photo together, like a screenshot.
I've got my virtual background on, I can't see my background.
So how should we do this?
Who's taking the screenshot? Everyone, just to explain, I keep getting told off for not posting enough images on social media by our social media ladies. So if you're happy to put some wine in your glass and raise it and say cheers to yourselves and Crystal Wine, and thanks for coming along, we'd be really grateful. So I think if you are happy to do that.
And turn on your video, everyone. If you have video, please turn it on.
We got everyone there?
Yeah, I think we have pretty much have everyone. So 3, 2, 1.
Yay!
Cheers!
I was trying to multitask. I think I grabbed a screenshot too, but
Do you get it? We can get everyone to freeze. Let's do one more take. 3, 2, 1. Freeze for 3 seconds in case we don't get a shot. Okay, good.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. I think before we have everyone leave the session, just a few points. Do we have a slide for that? Yeah. So the amazing Greywacke wines that you have just tasted are now on special offer for a limited time only. So go to our website, keen on the wines, buy while stock lasts. Follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Telegram because we have a lot of upcoming virtual masterclasses for you. In fact, this Saturday, we will also send an email to those who are on our mailing list on an upcoming session. Tag us on social media, share with your friends, and enjoy the session together. If you have any feedback today, we really apologize that we overrun the session, but hopefully we compensated back with a very educational session by Richard. So if you have any feedback, do feel free to drop us a note at marketing@crystalwines.com. So I think that's all, and hope to see you all in the next session. Bye.
Thanks, Crystal. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you, Richard.
Have a great afternoon.
You too. Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, so we're just trying to be polite. We're not going to close the browser. We'll let you leave the session on your own accord.